Rick Deckard is a Blade Runner in that he hunts down human clones, known as replicants, to their deaths after they have escaped the off-world colonies in the near future. This video is about his story, his character and what he does in the original movie, its sequel Blade Runner 2049 and any of the tie-in media. Deckard's story is not an easy one to tell. Fans have long speculated that Deckard himself was a replicant, built as a disposable hunter who happens to hunt other disposable humans. The sequel movie, Blade Runner 2049, uses the premise that Deckard is indeed a replicant, after the director of the first movie, Ridley Scott, confirmed that he was. However, the director and writers of the original movie may not have intended for Deckard to actually be a replicant. It is hinted that he is, but that may just have been to ensure the lines between what is human and what is a replicant remains blurred. Screenwriter Hampton Fancher confirms this. As such, events from the original movie can be explained in two ways. He is a replicant and he is not. The version in which he is a replicant is basically retconned into the franchise. To keep things simple, I will proceed with the fact that Deckard is indeed a replicant. I myself was a late convert to this idea, and I only accepted it when the sequel was released in 2017. With regards to the original Blade Runner movie, I will attempt to answer questions as to how that was arranged and what the consequences are to the story. We first meet Rick Deckard on the streets of a future dystopian Los Angeles. The viewer only has an inkling Rick is a Blade Runner, and instead he is more interested in ordering a bowl of noodles. Soon he is interrupted by Gaff, another Blade Runner who confronts him in the local dialect and orders him to accompany him to the police station. There, Deckard is forced to accept his assignment. Sideways glances by his boss Bryant give the viewer a notion that not everything is as it seems. This feeling is strengthened by the fact that Deckard asked some very basic questions and did not seem to know that the latest replicants have only a 4-year lifespan as a security measure. That is something a washed-up, burnt-out Blade Runner would definitely know. We could chalk it up to poor writing, and previously I did. But if Deckard is indeed a replicant, he may just have come fresh off the assembly line. Memories of other Blade Runner hunters were given to him to enable him to do his job. After accepting the job to hunt the group of replicants led by Roy Batty, he drops by the Tyrell Corporation to meet with the Nexus 6 model there so Deckard can see for himself how one behaves. At first he does not realize that the woman he meets there, Rachel, is the replicant Brian was referring to. At the insistence of Eldon Tyrell, founder of the company, he performs a Voight-Kampff test and determines that she is indeed a replicant after nearly 100 questions. Not the 30 that it usually takes. Eldon Tyrell explains that with the Nexus 6 they use other people's memories to create a plausible past for Rachel. That way she becomes more controllable. Rachel does not appear to know that she is even a replicant. Deckard quickly focuses his sights on his suspected replicant hideaway and investigates the flat with his sometimes partner Gaff. There he finds photos of what is one of the female replicants who has an unusual tattoo. He also finds some kind of scale from an animal in the bathtub. Back at his apartment, he is confronted by Rachel. Since their meeting, she has become convinced that she is a replicant and wants to prove that she isn't. After showing a photo of her youth as proof, Deckard reveals her memories are fake by revealing a considerable amount of detail. Afterwards, Deckard focuses his attention on one of the photos from the apartment until he gets a clear image of the woman's tattoo. That, along with identifying the scale as belonging to a snake, takes him to a nightclub called Taffy Lewis's. After first pretending he is an investigator, Zhora becomes suspicious and knocks him out cold. The famous foot chase ensues. Deckard uses his instincts just as much as his reflexes to hunt down Zhora, shooting her twice in the back as she crashes through a plate glass window. Bryant, accompanied by the silent Gaff, congratulates Deckard, but warns him that he still has to kill 4, not 3 replicants, as Rachel disappeared from the Tyrell Corporation. A visibly annoyed Deckard gets a parting comment from Bryant regarding the bottle he just bought from a vendor. Deckard spots Rachel across the street and makes his way through the crowd. Instead, he is confronted by Leon, a replicant who was close to Zhora. Leon overpowers Deckard, but a split second before his eyes are gouged out, Rachel shoots Leon through the head. Now Deckard is back on 3 replicants to hunt down. Back at his apartment, Deckard and Rachel grow close. Deckard tells Rachel he won't retire her, so for him he is now on 2, Roy Batty and Pris. During their confrontation, Rachel asks if he ever used the void camp test on himself. While Rachel meant to suggest the ever-blurring lines between human and replicant, for the viewer another possibility emerges. Deckard is indeed a replicant himself. Considering his fellow hunter Holden got shot in the opening scene, it makes sense to use disposable replicants to do the dirty work. If memories and skills can be implanted, you would have ready-made hunters. This, combined with the weird unicorn dream Deckard has earlier in the movie, confirms that to many that indeed he is a replicant. In the final act, Deckard is tasked with retiring the remaining 2 replicants, Roy and Pris, after they murder Eldon Tyrell and their unwitting accomplice J.F. Sebastian, a genetic designer working for Tyrell. Deckard makes the assumption that both replicants are holed up in Sebastian's apartment. Initially, after a desperate struggle, he manages to kill Pris, but Roy's superior mental and physical skill makes the fight decidedly one-sided. Deckard flees to the rooftop as Roy slowly starts to feel the effects of the limited 4-year lifespan as his body is starting to shut down. On the rooftop, Deckard once again tries to flee but nearly falls off. It is Roy that saves him. The latter accepts his fate and Deckard does not attempt to hurry it along. Instead, Roy Batty tells him in a now iconic scene the things he has seen in his short life. Viewers of the movie have interpreted Roy saving Deckard as another confirmation that Deckard is a replicant. Roy is meant to have recognized Deckard as one of his own and saves him despite the deaths within his own replicant cove. After Roy expires, he is confronted by Gaff. Uncertain how much he overheard, Gaff tosses him his gun and tells him, "Too bad she won't live, but then again who does?" At his apartment, Deckard urges Rachel to flee with him, fearing Gaff or somebody else will find her there. As they leave, Deckard finds one of the origami from Gaff, a unicorn. Deckard nods appreciatively. Again, for viewers, this comes off as a confirmation that Deckard is a replicant. Gaff must have known about the unicorn dream as it was implanted. The recognition Deckard has at the end of the movie is meant as acceptance of the fact he is a replicant. After so many hints that Deckard is a replicant, you could almost wonder why so many people, including myself, have thought he was not. I interpreted the movie literally. Nobody said that Deckard was a replicant, so I assumed he was not. However, Roy Batty and his cove are Nexus 6 replicants and are already a few years old. It stands to reason that newer models entered the market since then. I am assuming that neither Rachel nor Deckard are more than a year old. Viewers of this channel will know that I do not hold the sequel novels to Blade Runner in high regard. 3 novels, number 2 through 4, were written by K.W. Jeter and released in the 1990s. Truth be told, it has been since the 90s that I have read them, but they added little to the story other than explore some what-ifs. In the first novel, we find Deckard in hiding with Rachel just outside LA. Rachel has been placed in suspension to delay her aging process, a tacit acknowledgement that Deckard was not considered a replicant at this time in the franchise, despite what the director states in interviews. At least not by everyone. The Batty template in the novel thinks otherwise. Deckard is hired by the Tyrell heiress Sarah to hunt down and kill the missing sixth replicant. Besides the one mentioned that got killed by Bryant prior to the events of the movie, there was of course Roy Batty, Zhora, Pris and Leon. Throughout the novel, readers are left speculating who this replicant could be. But that is hardly his most costly fault. The first novel has the irritating habit of returning characters believed to be dead. J.F. Sebastian returns as a paraplegic. In the end, the missing sixth replicant is a hoax by Sarah Tyrell, continued in order to destroy the company. She captures Rachel, but Deckard manages to escape with her from the Tyrell HQ. However, Rachel has in fact been killed, and the woman he is with is Sarah, as Eldon Tyrell based Rachel on Sarah. And so the spin-off novels continue, just about destroying everything that was established in the movie, and to think that Ridley Scott considered them as possible storylines for a movie. Book 3 takes place on Mars with Deckard consulting on a movie about his experiences. Entire scenes, such as the shootout between Holden and Leon, are recreated using replicants who have no option but to carry out their paths until their deaths. Book 4 focuses on the Blade Runner Iris, who discovers by the end of the novel that her entire existence is fake when she is rescued by Deckard from a space station that ran as a simulation of Los Angeles. Her whole world was yet another illusion. All told, there is surprisingly little character development for Deckard, and such the books are best forgotten. For the first two-thirds of the movie, we actually do not see Deckard, though as Blade Runner and replicant K attempts to uncover the secret behind the once pregnant skeleton of Rachel, we do see the invisible hand of Deckard. In the movie 2049, it is simply assumed that Deckard was a replicant. Both he and Rachel were unique in that Eldon Tyrell managed to make them so they could have offspring, which they did. It is a genetic secret that has so far eluded Tyrell's successor, Deanna Wallace. After the child of Rachel and Deckard was hidden by the replicant underground, Deckard disappeared, though he may have been involved in deleting as many records of the child as possible, to prevent her from being found by those that think a replicant offspring will be a danger to the strict separation between humans and replicants. However, Kay does eventually manage to find Deckard. The latter had left a small wooden horse with the child. The wood was highly irradiated, something that could have only happened in Las Vegas, where terrorists detonated a dirty bomb. Only replicants have the ability to survive that, and Deckard and Rachel apparently did as they hid in the deserted city. Deckard still lives there, with a dog who may or may not be real. Kay has long since abandoned his programming and now calls himself Joe. With no intention of killing Deckard, he wonders whether he is the child of Deckard and Rachel. In an earlier scene, we already discovered that the memories he has of the wooden horse that returned upon finding it were implanted. To the viewer, this suggests somebody has placed Joe deliberately on the trail of Deckard. However, Joe still wonders. The reunion between the two Blade Runners is a difficult one. Only after a serious fistfight do they start to talk. Deckard explains how he managed to hide with the help of the replicant underground, but decided not to involve himself in the life of the child so as to not endanger them. Since then, he has lived in exile in Las Vegas. The meeting is interrupted by a snatch team from the Wallace Corporation led by Love. Deckard is captured and faces emotional manipulation at the hands of Deanna Wallace at their HQ. Wallace explains why he wants to have Deckard and a child. He hopes to unlock the replicant ability to produce children. As Deckard was the one who deleted most of the records of the child, including those at the orphanage, he could potentially lead Wallace right to the child. Before torturing Deckard off-world, he attempts one gambit. He introduces Deckard to yet another Rachel replicant, looking exactly as she did for the first time they met at the Tyrell Corporation all those years back, with her wearing the now iconic skirt suit. However, with great difficulty, Deckard rejects this Rachel and she is promptly shot by Love. The consequences are that Neander Wallace will enact his backup plan and sends Deckard off-world. Meanwhile, Joe has been rescued from Las Vegas by the replicant underground. Its leader, Fraser, denies Joe is the child of Deckard and Rachel, but warns him Deckard knows too much about the underground movement. Joe is now resolved to rescue Deckard from his fate, in order to gain some humanity for himself, now that he will be hunted down for going off script. As Deckard is flown out of the city, his convoy is attacked by Joe. He manages to down all of the vehicles, with the one containing Deckard and Love crashing near the seawall. The ensuing fight between Joe and Love is vicious, with the tide turning a number of times. Love manages to stab Joe badly before he finally manages to drown her. Joe rescues Deckard from drowning, and together they set off to find Deckard's child. Joe has since Vegas deduced who the child is. She is the memory specialist Joe consulted earlier in the movie regarding the memories of the little wooden horse with the dates on them. A DNA analysis already states that the child would have an autoimmune disease, and the young woman, Dr. Anna Stalin, resides in an isolation chamber. Joe has put two and two together and takes Deckard to see her. Joe remains outside, and Deckard, sensing Joe is mortally wounded, asks if he will be alright. Joe states that he will be, and peacefully dies watching the snow fall to the ground. Deckard walks in and is finally reunited with his daughter. And so that is how the story of Deckard ends. I myself was always skeptical about the need for a sequel to the Blade Runner movie, but director Denis Villeneuve and writers Hampton Fancher and David Peoples succeeded beyond my expectations with 2049. It is a worthy sequel to the original, while also respecting the original movie by Ridley Scott. At no time did I think, oh, this is not my Blade Runner, or that is not my Deckard. That leaves us only to speculate how the story of Deckard and his daughter Anna would develop. Obviously, they cannot touch each other due to her need for near total isolation because of her autoimmune disease. I suspect that visits through the front door are also too risky. Deckard will probably re-establish his contact with Fraser and the replicant underground to get help. But it also appears that the two of them are stuck on Earth. Beyond such speculation, it is difficult to determine if Deckard will return to the franchise. The actor Harrison Ford is not getting any younger, and at 79 it is unlikely he will portray the character again. Recently, Ridley Scott, who isn't exactly young either, announced the Blade Runner series is in the making. Blade Runner 2099, as the title suggests, is set 50 years after the events of the sequel movie. Still in early production, I think it is unlikely that the character Deckard will make a return. So that was it for my lengthy background video on Rick Deckard, the main character from the movie Blade Runner and its sequel 2049. This video was meant as the first in the series. I will probably also do a deep dive into the characters Rachel, Kay or Joe as he prefers to be called, and maybe the antagonists such as Tyrell and Wallace. No doubt the topic of who is a replicant and who is not will also return. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it if you can, that will really help my channel out. If you want to see more content like it, then please hit the subscribe button.